In the last episode, we introduced the tide and how it's made by huge waves flowing along the coast. In this episode, we're going to explore how you can actually spot the tide. Today, I'm going on a tide walk in Margate to look out for clues if the tide is high or low, rising or falling. So the tidal pool where I was just swimming, that in itself is a really good clue for what the tide's doing, because you can see the water's in the tidal pool, but the reef is completely exposed. And the way that tidal pools work is the tide rises all around it and it pours over the walls, and that's what fills the pool up. And then as the tide falls out at sea, the walls hold the water in the pool. So what we can see now is that it's low tide, and it also tells us how high the tide gets, so it goes over those walls. So what we've got here is a really good sign of the high tide line. So there are two main clues here. We've got the line of seaweed you can see running along. So what's happened is the tide has pushed the seaweed all the way up to that point. And then slightly subtler, if you look at the texture of the sand, on this side it's really smooth, it's been washed smooth by the tide. Whereas on that side, it's much more corrugated from people's footprints. So that shows us this is how high the most recent tide got. So if you know the cycle of tidal currents flowing along the shore, you can use that to work out if the tide is rising or falling. So if you look behind me, there's a cargo ship there and it's at anchor and it's facing this way, which tells us that the currents must be flowing that way. We're going to explore why this happens in a little bit more detail in one of the later videos. But we know currents are going that way, and in Margate where I am now, we're part of the Thames estuary, and when the tide is rising, the water is all flowing into the river. So that gives us a clue that the chances are the tide is rising, and that's why the currents are flowing that way and pushing that boat facing into the current. Depending on the moon phase, you get higher high tides. So when there's only a half moon, the high tides are lower. And when there's a new moon or a full moon, the tides are higher. And this seaweed gives a really good idea of the two changes. So over there, it's thicker and it's denser, so it's underwater more of the time, and it stops about here. So this tells us this is probably how high a neap tide gets. Whereas the spring tides around the full moon and the new moon, they're higher, but they're less frequent. And they go to about here where this thinner seaweed stops. And then this is probably, most of the time it's out in the air. So we know this is a high spring tide line, and back there is a high neap tide line. We'll talk about that in more detail in one of the later videos. Posts like the one behind me are really good for spotting the vertical rise in the tide. And all you need to do is look how high the seaweed grows up it and where the paintwork stays fresh. This little stretch of beach here is a really good example of how it's so easy to get cut off by the tide. So when we look down there, there's loads of sand and people could easily be having a picnic, think they've got lots of time, but actually we've seen from the ship at anchor that the tide is rising, and on really shallow beaches you only need a little bit of a rise in the tide and it floods a lot of the beach. And that exit around there has already been blocked, and if you look behind me there you can see there's just a tiny strip of sand. Maybe in 10, 15, 20 minutes that's going to be covered, in which case the people having a picnic down there will be completely cut off by the tide. There's absolutely nowhere for them to get, so they've got to climb up this quite high wall. One trick for working out what the tide is doing is to note the moon phase, because the tide times are directly connected to the moon. Here in Margate, high tide at the full moon is always around midday. Different beaches have got their different landmarks, and one of the ones I really like in Margate is the Anthony Gormley Another Time. It's the sculpture behind me, and it's really useful because you can tell what the height of the tide is when the water gets to a certain level. So what you do is when it is at that level, you check your tide app and you see what height the tide is. And I know that when the water's around his waist, the tide's about 3.5 meters high. So when I'm walking around here, I can quickly look at how high the water is up on him, and I can tell what the height of the tide is. Sometimes you can tell the tide is rising by the amount of detritus along the waterline being pushed up the beach. It's then left on the high tide line, and the waterline on the falling tide has much less detritus. I went down on the beach looking for clues and spotted two ladies horse riding, who told me that they only ride on the intertidal zone because the sand is compacted and better for their horses' hooves. So if you see horse riders galloping along the beach, they'll be below the high tide line, and chances are it'll be around low tide. So looking at all the clues in the harbour here tells us that the height of high tide is probably about here. So in about 4 hours time, if we were standing here, the surface of the water would be there. So if you look all around, you can see that by the seaweed layer on the harbour wall. So you've got where it's dark and then where it's light, and you can get that really clear feeling as we go all the way around. You can see that really clearly, and then as we get even further, you can see the steps where people see. You can see the dark steps, and they get lighter, and then they're really light. So all of this area is all covered by water in a couple of hours' time.